The Industrial Revolution started in Europe, actually, more specifically, started in England in the 1760s and was well underway by the 1780s in England. Didn't really begin in the United States until around 1790. And this individual is going to be one of the more prominent cogs in that developing machine, Eli Whitney, who in the early 1790s sort of made an impact by coming up with the idea of interchangeable musket parts, which, to explain that now, muskets and rifles before this point had been made by gunsmiths, and the way it worked was that a gunsmith, a craftsman, would build a rifle from scratch and make all the parts. And the size of the parts might differ slightly from gunmaker to gunmaker. The idea that Whitney put forward was that these parts, parts of the gun, could be machined to a set of specifications, so that down to the smallest measurement, they were exactly the same. Now, what this meant was that previously, if something broke on your gun, you had to go find a gunsmith, and that gunsmith would have to create from scratch a piece to replace the broken piece on your gun that was able to match the measurements that the original gunsmith had used. If you've got them all machine tooled and the exact same size, something breaks on your gun, you just get that part, and it can easily be replaced. So this sort of revolutionized the gun business. A couple of years after that, Whitney introduced what was immediately referred to as the cotton gin. It has nothing to do with alcoholic drinks. It is a gin as in short for the word engine. So really it's the cotton engine. And there's a picture of one. Now, cotton had not really been that feasible to grow before this, although some people were growing it. About 5 million pounds were produced in the United States in 1793. But because all those tiny seeds had to be picked out of the cotton by hand, it was an extremely time-consuming process, and all those man hours cut into the profitability of growing the stuff. And what this engine did was you put the cotton in there and just run it through, and the seeds get automatically picked out 50 times faster than a person doing it by hand. And that immediately meant that it was feasible now to grow cotton, and lots of people started growing cotton in the South. By 1820, 27 years after the invention of this machine, the U.S. had gone from 5 million pounds a year to 170 million pounds. And by 1860, we were looking at much more than that, probably like 500 or 600 million pounds at least. So this led to the rise of what became known as King Cotton, because the U.S. was very quickly able to dominate the global cotton market. And all through the South, people were growing cotton. And in the North was impacted as well. This is where the Industrial Revolution part of the story continues, in that textile mills started to be built. The first one in the 1790s, early 1790s. And more of these factories were being built to process more and more cotton being grown in the South. Now, especially all throughout New England is where these factories started to spring up. Now, what did that mean sort of in the long term? Well, the generation referred to as the Founding Fathers had been unable to come to an agreement about slavery when they were working on the Constitution. And if you will recall, what they did was They agreed that the U.S. government could end the slave trade, that is, the importing of slaves from Africa. But they decided that could not be done until exactly 20 years later, because they thought, since slavery was kind of on the way out already, within 20 years it would be even more so on the way out. And they had not factored in the cotton gin because it hadn't been invented yet. So when the slave trade was ended and no new slaves could legally be imported from Africa in 1808, that's just about the time that demand for slaves in the South started to grow exponentially as more and more of these large cotton plantations were being started. And that led to the need for slaves led to a sort of an internal slave trade. The upper South or the Mid-South, areas like North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, where they didn't really grow too much cotton, and they had instead been using slaves to grow tobacco. There was less demand now for those slaves and greater demand in the Deep South in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. So a lot of those slaves were sold from North Carolina, Tennessee, and down to Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Over 1 million over the course of a few decades were transported from the Upper South to the Deep South. And the entire economy of the American South was centered on cotton. And because it was centered on cotton and because people wanted to maximize their profits and spend less on labor, it also was centered more and more on slavery. And, the fact that all those factories and the shipping in the North were also connected to this meant it wasn't just a Southern thing. Same time, in the North, the Industrial Revolution was leading to the invention of new things like the steel plow by good old John Deere, the mechanical reaper by Cyrus McCormick, which added with the ability to now open up new markets in the upper Midwest because of transportation increases, led to commercial farming growing in the North and the old Northwest or the Midwest. This happened at a time that the need for wheat had grown because the Napoleonic Wars over in Europe, all their farms were either devastated by the fighting or the people who were supposed to farm them were dead. So there's a big market for wheat especially, and wheat production tripled within a few years in the American North and Northwest. So those farmers out in the Northwest/Midwest, they got the eastern markets, and the northern farmers who had been providing for the eastern markets started just producing for the cities. And the markets began to expand. Cities began to grow, like the city of Chicago, which would become a railroad hub. And the way people worked began to change, particularly when they started applying the principles that Eli Whitney had applied with factory-tooled machine parts. Factories and workshops became ever more important than individual craftsmen, like, for example, the traditional gunsmith. The new factories that made things, instead of having one guy who was an absolute master craftsman who knew how to make a gun or a shoe or a cabinet or whatever from scratch completely by himself, which took a while, now you had this factory system where the tasks were divided up, and you didn't need to know how to do everything about making, for example, a gun. You just had to know how to put on the trigger guard, and other people were doing the other stuff. So it required less skill. Now, because it required less skill, it could be done in these circumstances. It could be done a lot faster, so more guns, shoes, cabinets, or whatever were produced. Because they were able to produce more and produce them more quickly, the price of the items went down, right? Because supply and demand. When things were made by craftsmen, they were made slowly. And what this also meant was that because demand was being filled by the increased production, and because workers required less skill to work in these factories, then the wages they were paid went way, way down. A master craftsman might take 5 times longer to make a shoe by himself, but his shoes fetched a high price before the advent of the factories. Now, a shoe is a shoe. And so this is going to even further hurt those craftsmen and specialized workers. Now, I mentioned that factories sprang up in the North. The very first such factory was in 1790, before the cotton gin, in Rhode Island. It was a water-powered factory, as many of the earlier ones were, but quickly that was replaced by steam at these factories, and you would see the city landscapes dotted by these smokestacks producing the smoke and steam from the burning of coal to run the machines. The first large-scale factory was in Waltham, Massachusetts. And in fact, Massachusetts became sort of home base for textile manufacturing in the United States. In fact, one company, the Boston Associates, built an entire town in Massachusetts, specifically just to house workers for their factories. The town was called Lowell. It was named after the guy who had owned the company, who had passed away by this time. So they had several factories, and then they built a lot of houses to house the workers. And as that city grew, it kind of gobbled up nearby small towns and made them part of the city. So that eventually there were 52 textile mills in the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. Now, by 1860, there were more textile mills in this one city in Massachusetts than there were in the entire South. And about 10,000 workers were employed in them. The young men who worked in these factories tended to often be Irish immigrants. The young women, who were a majority of the workers, tended to be from the surrounding Massachusetts and other New England areas, countrysides. In fact, about 3/4 of them were known as mill girls. They moved from the farm into the city to work in these factories, and they had factory housing, and they essentially lived and worked in these mills under very, very difficult and unpleasant conditions. Now, I mentioned those Irish immigrants. At the same time this stuff was gearing up and more factories were being made, immigration was increasing from Europe, particularly in the 1830s. For various reasons. Overpopulation in the home country, or political unrest, which was pretty common at that time, especially in the 1830s, or just natural disaster like famine, which is what motivated a lot of the Irish immigrants, because there was a big reliance on potato farming in Ireland, and there was a potato blight that killed most of the potatoes, so it was hard to get work or food. So huge numbers of Irish people came to the U.S. Large numbers of Germans came at around this time. There was some political unrest in Prussia and the other Germanic states. A lot of Scandinavians. Now, Scandinavia is not a country, it's a region. Scandinavia is the countries that are sort of the descendants of the Norse or the Vikings, and that is Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. So a lot of them came. Many of them wound up in the Midwest, the upper Midwest. Particularly, in an area that was being settled at this time, Wisconsin and Minnesota. A lot of Scandinavian immigrants wound up in Minnesota, which, by the way, is why we have the Minnesota Vikings. And it was also the origin of that very distinctive northern Midwest accent in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa. Oh yeah, you betcha. Had that sort of a musical lilt to it that comes from those Scandinavian languages. Also, a lot of English immigrants were coming over at this time. And it was at the same time that there was a labor shortage in the U.S. because all these new factories were being built and they had to have people to work them. So, it just sort of was a symbiotic relationship, if you will. But it led to a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in the U.S. from people who had been born in the U.S. They're here to take our jobs. So by the early 1840s, there was a very strong streak of what's called nativism. And that essentially is like, being extremely opposed to all immigration and all immigrants. And that feeling grew among certain segments of the American population over the course of the 1840s and 1850s. All right, well, speaking of New England, there was a philosophic movement that developed in New England, closely related to the Romantic movement, which had originated in Europe. Romantic movement being a strong emphasis on love of nature and a strong emphasis on emotion rather than logic, a strong emotion or a strong emphasis on getting in touch with your inner feelings and becoming one with nature, which was a kind of a reaction against the Enlightenment, which, as you will remember, was the age of reason, where everything was about the scientific method and about logic and so forth. The transcendentalists believed that the truths of life can be discovered by things that are within you as a human being. Freedom lies within you, not without, from your mind and soul, not on sensory data, not on empirical facts. And a couple of the most prominent transcendentalists in New England were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is well known for his work, Walden, where he had sort of isolated himself in the forests and wrote about that. Also was opposed to things like paying taxes. Emerson would be an extremely influential national figure. Transcendentalists also had a strong emphasis on the individual, right? Because your freedom and your truth comes from inside you, according to them. And then you transcend beyond just your five senses. So with that in mind, I wanted to just share with you a brief excerpt from one of the most famous works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. It is an essay called The American Scholar, in which Emerson is outlining the importance of being an educated person. And again, this is an excerpt, and I'm going to stop as I'm reading this and sort of clarify, modernize the language a little bit here and there. All right. Now remember, transcendentalism is all about finding the truth inside yourself, being an individual and being independent. So, in self-trust, all the virtues are comprehended. Free should the scholar be, free and brave, free even to the definition of freedom, without any hindrance that does not arise out of his own constitution or his own strength. Brave For fear is a thing which a scholar by his very function puts behind him. Fear always springs from ignorance. It is a shame to him if his tranquillity amid dangerous times arise from the presumption that, like children and women, his is a protected class, or if he seek a temporary peace by the diversion of his thoughts from politics or vexed questions, hiding his head like an ostrich in the flowering bushes, peeping into microscopes and turning rhymes as a boy whistles to keep his courage up. So is the danger a danger still. So is the fear worse. Man-like, let him turn and face it. Let him look into its eye and search its nature, inspect its origin. See the whelping of this lion, the lion being fear, the whelping meaning birth. See the whelping of this lion, which lies no great way back. He will then find in himself a perfect comprehension of its nature and extent. He will have made his hands meet on the other side, and can henceforth defy it and pass on superior. So I don't recommend that if you come across a lion, you grab a hold of it and try to make your hands meet on the other side. But in this case, he's talking about the issues, major issues of the day and the fear that surrounds them. Get your arms around it so you can see how big they are. And then you will have a better idea of what you're facing. And that you can therefore defy it and prove yourself superior to it. The world is his who can see through its pretension. What deafness, what stone-blind custom, what overgrown error that you behold is only there by sufferance that is being allowed, by your sufferance, by your allowing it. See it to be a lie, and you have already dealt it its mortal blow. Well, I wanted to share this with you because there's a lot of transcendentalism in that, but also there's a lot of wisdom in that. That particular quote, I think, is extraordinarily relevant and valuable to anyone who seeks to be educated, because it lays out what an educated person should do, which is face the problems of the world, not run away from them, not hide from them, see through their pretension, and therefore find ways to overcome them. It's the duty of a scholar to do these things. All right, well, at around the same time that this was happening, this transcendentalism, there was a broader emphasis on individualism in America in general. Now we're talking about all through the country, people who never even heard of transcendentalism and probably wouldn't have agreed with a lot of the stuff that it said. But this idea of being an individual was very important because of the Industrial Revolution. It made people feel like cogs in a machine. It made them feel like they as individuals didn't matter as much. Therefore, more emphasis was put on the sovereignty of the individual and the idea of a rugged individual, that is, someone who is self-sufficient, who takes care of themselves and their own problems and doesn't have to rely on anyone else, which is a paradox. It's ironic because the deeper into the industrial and market revolutions that America got, the more interdependent everyone was, the more it was actually true. It was actually a fact that what other people did in other parts of the country were going to affect you, and you had no control over it. So that feeling of a lack of control really led to this deep desire to feel like you are in control, that you don't have to depend on anyone else, that you have self-reliance, self-determination, self-improvement, and that you are a self-made person. We'll talk a little bit more about how some of these things showed up in the American culture.